What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another video. Now let's get these out of the way and I'll tell you what we are talking about. So today we are talking about aperture and specifically the difference between a 400mm f4 lens and a 400mm f2.8 lens. Now anybody who has been out looking for a 400mm lens, you will know that there is a big difference price wise when it comes to those two lenses. An f4 lens is generally always a lot cheaper than an f2.8 lens, and so why not just go for the f4 lens? And I thought I would talk to you today about the main differences between the two and why an f2.8 is so much more expensive and what do you get for that money. If you like the sound of that, I'm going to ask you to do two things for me. Number one, make sure you hit that like button, hit the thumbs up because it helps me out loads and loads on my channel. Number two, if you haven't already, those of you who've done it already, you know what, kick back for 10 seconds. But those of you that haven't, hit that subscribe button, make sure you do. Go do it for me right now because it'd be great to have you guys along for loads of other future videos. So it's all good me saying f4, f2.8, but which specific lenses are we talking about? So first up, we're talking about this. Now this is the Canon 400mm EF IS Mkiii f4 400mm lens. This is pretty much one of the top of the range Canon f4 lenses that you can buy right now. The other one we're going to talk about is this. This is the EF 400mm f2.8 IS Mkiii. This is Canon's brand new flagship top of the range 400mm f2.8. Now boy, do these lenses have some price tags attached to them. So right now you can buy this lens right here for £6,100. £6,100. And you can buy this lens right here for just under £12,200. £12,000. Yes, that's right. I have got nearly £20,000 worth of Canon lenses sat in front of me, and yep, it would be fair to say that I'm absolutely myself. Because if I don't get these back in one piece, there is a hell of a security deposit owed. So let's be careful with these during the filming of this video. You probably guessed it at this stage, I don't own either of these lenses. I've managed to borrow them before making this video right here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about that, right? The biggest difference with these is the price point. And that kind of stays the same across the board with these lenses. Because yes, the big models and the newer models of course have that really high price point. But more specifically, it's nearly double the price. 6,000, 12,000. You're talking a massive difference. And not just double the price, that difference is £6,000. Think what you could do with £6,000, right? That's a huge amount of money. So of course, if you're considering buying this lens, you've got to seriously ask yourself the question, actually, could I get away with this lens instead? And that stays the same all the way across the board. If you guys are looking at used gear, like I do for a lot of my gear, you could currently pick up the Mark I version of this lens used on eBay for somewhere just below about £3,000. You could buy the Mark I version of this lens used on eBay for probably around like 1,600, 1,700, something like that. So actually that consistency of kind of double the price is nearly there. Of course, the gap gets shorter the older the lens gets and the older the model you're talking about. But nonetheless, whatever your budget, if you're looking at a version of this lens and a version of this lens, chances are there is going to be a big price point between the two. Now let's just quickly compare them physically. That's one of the things that you would have noticed straight away, right? Is there is a massive difference with the size of these lenses. If I put these both down here on the desk in front of me, you can see that there is a good probably 8 inches difference in length. This right here is the f4 lens. Now this I would say is actually very comparable size wise to my 300 2.8, my Mark I would say that's roughly the same, although actually it's lighter, but I would say it's roughly the same. Then over here, we have this absolute beast. Now, ironically, this huge one, this I would say is lighter than my 300 2.8 Mark I. Goes to show the technology now to make a lens this size that much lighter. But that is the size. You can see that is an absolute huge lens. Crazy. I mean, it's like the length of my arm. And of course you can also see the diameter of the two, big difference in terms of how big they are on the actual diameter of the lens. Now the main reason for that is actually to do with the aperture itself. Those of you who are a bit less familiar with what aperture means, that is basically the aperture blades of a lens that open and close to create a bigger or a smaller opening. Now actually the bit that's sometimes confusing is the bigger the opening, the smaller the number. So for example, an f2.8 lens would have a bigger aperture and let in more light than an f4 lens, which would be a little bit smaller. The reason for that is of course it allows it to let in more light. The more light it lets into the lens, the faster it is, and that's part of what we're going to talk about in just a minute. That coupled with the fact there's going to be a bit more technology in this lens, there's going to be more actual glass elements in this lens, and overall those are some of the things that make this lens so much bigger. And that's something to consider, right? Because that is a hell of a commitment to own a lens this size versus a lens this size. Simple things like your bags, right? The reason I've got hold of this lens is because I'm using it to shoot an event on Sunday. I need to think about how I'm going to transport this lens. It doesn't fit into my bag that I normally put my 300 into because it's so much bigger. And that's one of the things you need to think about if you're looking at this lens over this lens, is it is much more of a commitment. Even when they're folded down with the hoods on, this is still a huge amount bigger. You need to think about how you're going to store it, how you're going to carry it around, how you're going to carry the weight of it generally when you're using it. The size and the physical difference between the two is definitely, I think, quite a big factor. So let's move on to the performance difference between the two. What do you get with an f2.8 lens that you can't get with an f4 lens? Well, there's a couple of things. The biggest thing, and perhaps the reason why there is such a jump, is the bit I talked about earlier. And that is the speed of the lens. And by that, I mean the amount of light that this lens lets in. The reason this is such a staple in a sports photographer's bag, a wildlife photographer's bag, is because of how quick it is. People shooting fast action need fast shutter speeds. The faster your shutter speed, that then means the higher the ISO number needs to be, or the lower that aperture number needs to be. Now the trouble is, if you set out there with an f4 lens and you need your shutter speed to be, let's say, 12/50th of a second, well that's fine, but your ISO level is going to need to be up quite high to be able to achieve that shutter speed with f4 and get the right exposure of your image. An f2.8 lens lets in a little bit more light, which means if you have that shutter speed exactly the same at 12/50th of a second, you're not going to need your ISO level to be as high as you would have done with the f4 to achieve the exact same exposure. Now, I set out this afternoon and shot a couple of examples. Now, right here in the UK, there is a lockdown. There's not that much sports going on. I'm shooting some sports, and actually I am at the weekend. But I thought I would go and find some of the finest athletes here in the Sambles household that I could take some photos of. And I've gone and taken those photos at exactly the same shutter speed. And I've taken one at f4 and I've taken one at f2.8. So let's take a look at these finely tuned athletes in action. Here's the first photo. So there you go. That is a photo shot with this Canon f2.8 lens. Okay, so I've shot this at 400mm f2.8, a shutter speed of 12/50th of a second. And in order to achieve the right exposure with those settings, I found that I had to set my ISO level to 3200. So with an ISO of 3200 with f2.8, I managed to get that shutter speed of 12/50th of a second, and that got me the perfect exposure on my image. So then I set up and I took that exact same photo with this lens, with the f4. So with the same distance away from the subject, so still at 400mm, I kept my shutter speed exactly the same, 12/50th of a second. Of course, I couldn't do f2.8, I had to do f4. So I shot this at f4. Now, first of all, watch what happens if I keep the rest of the settings exactly the same. So this one is shot 400mm, 12/50th of a second, f4, and still with my ISO level at 3200. Here's how the image looks. Now, of course, it looks darker. The reason for that is that we've got less light coming into this 400mm lens. So what I had to do was to bump my ISO level up. And you can see that to get the perfect exposure with this image, I actually had to bring my ISO level up to 6400. Now, I was actually a bit surprised there was that much of a difference. I thought I'd maybe have to bring it up to sort of 5000, but to have to go the extra jump to 6400 surprised me ever so slightly. So you can see we've actually had to go up quite a bit. Now, it's kind of a 50-50 one, this, right? That could be a big problem for some people, and it might not be much of a problem for some other people. Both of these images were shot with my Canon 1DX. Now, my other camera body is my Canon R6. Now, both of those are very capable at higher ISO levels. So actually, if I had to shoot an image at 6400, which I have to quite often in some of like the basketball gyms that I shoot in, I wouldn't be too worried about that. Actually, that would be okay and I could get away with that. So if that was a deciding factor for me, maybe less of a problem if that was the only variable, but it's not, and there's some others I'm going to get onto in 1 second. But actually, if you've got a camera body that is capable of shooting 6400, 8000 ISO, then actually maybe the f4 would be okay for you, and at that same point you save yourself £6,000. Something to think about. Let's move on to the next variable. So the other thing that you get with an f2.8 lens is that you get a shallower depth of field than you get with f4. Again, those of you guys less familiar, the lower that f number, the lower your aperture number, the shallower the depth of field. So if you have a lens that's at like f1.8, you'll have a really shallow depth of field. Whereas if you set your aperture to like f9 or f11, like you might do if you're photographing a landscape, for example, you will have a much wider or much deeper depth of field. So let's have a look at my two images again. The first image here, you'll see, was shot at f2.8. Now you can see what I'm talking about, right? Our boxer right in the front, of course, is the subject we've focused on. He's nice and sharp and in focus. Now on the right, you can see our good old friend the Stormtrooper. He is slightly out of focus. He's a bit softer. Okay, you can't quite make out the detail in the front of him. And you'll see on the left-hand side, you probably can't even tell, but that's our good friend the car mechanic, and actually, he's completely out of focus. You can tell he's there, but you can't see any of the detail. He is completely out of focus. And that's what I mean by the shallow depth of field. Now let's look at the image that was shot with the f4 lens. Here we go again. So now you can see this one again. Of course, the subject is the boxer. He's nice and sharp. But the difference here is that you can make out a lot more detail in the Stormtrooper. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying he's fully in focus, but he mostly is. You can see a lot of the detail. And if you look at a good old friend in the back there, the car mechanic, you can actually make out some of the detail with him now. You can see some of the detail in his face, which you couldn't see at all in the f2.8 image. Let's just compare them back to back. So here's the f2.8. And here's the f4. You can see what I mean with the shallower depth of field. Now that's something that can be really important when you're trying to get those nice professional looking images. The more crushed the background is, the more kind of creamy looking background that you get, the more professional it can feel and the more it isolates the subject of your photo. That's something I definitely want to achieve when I'm out there taking sports photos. I want my subject nice and sharp in focus, and I like that separation from the background where I get that nice kind of blurry, kind of creamy effect in the background. Now, again, if that kind of look for you and that more professional look is something that's really, really important, maybe it's worth the 6,000 difference. But actually, if that isn't something you're trying to achieve right now, well then maybe you won't get all the benefits of the f2.8 lens. Maybe the f4 lens is going to be good enough for you. Okay, now this isn't a direct performance comparison between these two lenses. That isn't what this video is about, but it would be wrong to talk about this without kind of mentioning it, right? Because the other thing to think about is that this Canon f2.8, this is Canon's flagship 400mm lens. This is the best of the best that Canon do when it comes to 400mm. That inevitably means that the technology, the detail, the performance of this lens is going to be to some degree better than this 400mm lens. The difference isn't necessarily going to be huge. And what I would say is if you look at the images again, you can't really see much difference. But there is some. And if I just show you now a 100% crop of both those images, this is the 100% crop of the f2.8, and this is the 100% crop of the f4 lens. Now, you might not see any difference at all. A more trained eye, and especially if you're really pixel peeping, you might see some. But what I would say is that there is some difference. I would say if you were getting into the detail and you were really scrutinizing, the performance and the focus of this f2.8 lens is cleaner. It looks sharper, and overall, if you're really getting into the detail, it does produce a better quality image. The other thing which I noticed for you sports and action photographers out there, the focus with this lens was faster than the focus with this lens. Now, this wasn't bad, it wasn't like searching all over the place, but it certainly didn't snap onto the subject quite as quick as the f2.8. I always find these lenses perform really well with autofocus, and you know what, if you sent me out to shoot a sports match with this lens, I'd be totally fine. I wouldn't be struggling to get the focus. But was it as good a focus as this one? No, it wasn't quite as quick. This one was almost instantaneous. This one I felt to be ever so slightly slower. Don't get me wrong, if you were just testing this lens without using this one at all and someone said to you how was the autofocus, you'd say it was fine. I'm not saying it's a problem, but it's not as good as this one. So where does that leave you? Which one do you buy? Which is better? Can you get away with an f4 lens? And I think for me, the overall answer is that yeah, you know what, you probably can, and especially nowadays, with cameras being so capable at those higher ISO numbers, I think you could get away with an f4 lens where you need to. Especially for you guys who are starting out in sports photography. I started out using an old Sigma f4 lens. I think it was the Sigma 100 to 300 f4, and I got by with that. I was pairing that with my 7D, which was rubbish at higher ISO numbers. So if you can get away with those slightly higher ISO numbers, then yeah, the f4 could absolutely be for you, especially if you're stretching with a budget and you can't afford this type of lens over here. The difference, of course, comes down to the detail. When we're getting into the absolute detail of how much light does this lens let in, what kind of depth of field and creamy backgrounds do you get with this lens, how quick is the autofocus, how good is the overall image quality. The reality is they are better, but the big question, and the question which really you have to ask yourselves, because I can't answer for you, is it £6,000 better? The honest answer is no. It's probably not £6,000 better than this one, but that unfortunately is where big lenses in modern day sports, wildlife, f2.8 400mm, 500, 600mm lenses, you don't tend to get those in f2.8, they tend to be f4, f5.6, but they are expensive, and unfortunately to get those small differences you pay a lot of money, and to get that difference in the quality and the amount of light, that's where the money comes in, and that is why photography is not the cheapest hobby to get into. I hope you guys found that useful. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, do me a favour, hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. I'm going to go and safely pack these bad boys back up into their bags so I do not risk damaging them at all. I'm using this one on Sunday to shoot a rugby match. I'll be able to share some of the images with you that I took with this lens. You'll be able to find those over on my Instagram account at RobSamblesPort, so go check that out if you're not following it already. In the meantime guys, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next video.